What if I told you that a single photograph from 1869 could shatter everything you thought you knew about the end of slavery in America? What if the most damning evidence of post-Civil War deception was hiding in plain sight, concealed beneath a simple wooden table in a Savannah photography studio? Before we dive into this haunting story that will change how you see American history forever, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like Samuel's deserve to be remembered, and you won't want to miss what we uncover next. Today, we're traveling back to 1869 Savannah, Georgia, where a young boy named Samuel sat for what appeared to be an ordinary portrait. But when modern experts examined this photograph with advanced technology, they discovered something so disturbing, so deliberately hidden, that it rewrote our understanding of what freedom really meant in post-Civil War America. This is the story of how one photograph became the most powerful evidence that slavery didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation. It simply learned to hide in the shadows. It's a story of deception, courage, and the ultimate triumph of truth over lies that spans more than 150 years. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Morrison's photography studio on Bull Street, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The air was thick with the chemical smell of developing solutions and the faint aroma of magnolia blossoms drifting in from the street. It was March 15th, 1869, and Savannah was slowly rebuilding itself from the ashes of war. The city bore the scars of Sherman's march to the sea, like a patient recovering from surgery, healing but forever changed. Samuel Washington, though he had chosen that surname himself only months before, sat perfectly still in the ornate chair positioned before the camera. At 14, he possessed the kind of stillness that came not from patience, but from years of learning that movement could bring punishment. His dark eyes, wide and intelligent, stared directly into the lens with an expression that photographers of the era would have called dignified composure. But those who knew how to read the subtle language of survival might have recognized something else. The careful mask of someone who had learned to hide his true feelings so completely that even he sometimes forgot what lay beneath. Behind the camera, Jeremiah Morrison adjusted the focus with practiced precision. Morrison had opened his studio just 2 years prior, capitalizing on the post-war demand for formal portraits. The war had created a hunger for permanence, for proof of existence and dignity that could survive the chaos of a world turned upside down. Freed slaves in particular sought these photographs as tangible evidence of their new status, proof of their humanity and citizenship that they could send to relatives scattered across the South by the brutal economics of slavery. "Hold steady now, boy," Morrison instructed, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man accustomed to directing subjects. "This exposure will take nearly 30 seconds. Don't even blink if you can help it." Morrison was a transplant from Boston, drawn south by the opportunities that Reconstruction promised. He was not an unkind man, but neither was he particularly observant when it came to the subtle signs of distress that someone like Samuel had learned to conceal. To Morrison, this was simply another portrait session, another opportunity to capture the dignity of the newly freed for posterity. Samuel's hands rested carefully on his knees, his posture erect but not rigid. He wore a simple white cotton shirt, clean and pressed with military precision, with dark trousers that had been carefully mended at the knees with thread that almost matched the original fabric. The clothes were better than anything he had owned during slavery, but they carried their own burden. They were costume pieces in an elaborate performance, designed to create an impression that bore little resemblance to reality. To any observer, he appeared to be exactly what the photograph was meant to portray: a young freedman making his way in the world, dignified and hopeful. The composition was carefully arranged to suggest prosperity and progress. The clean clothes, The formal pose, the studio setting itself all spoke to a narrative of successful integration into free society. But beneath the carefully arranged scene, a different reality lurked, like a serpent coiled in tall grass. The wooden table positioned strategically in front of Samuel's chair wasn't merely a photographic prop chosen for aesthetic reasons. Its placement had been deliberate, calculated with the precision of a military strategist to conceal what lay beneath. Around Samuel's ankles, hidden from the camera's unblinking eye, iron shackles bit into his flesh, the same shackles that had bound him for the past 8 months, ever since his supposed liberation from slavery. The metal was old, forged in the same foundries that had produced the chains of slavery for generations. But these shackles were different in one crucial way. They were designed to be hidden. Unlike the heavy, obvious restraints used on plantations, these were thinner, more discreet, crafted specifically for the new era of concealed bondage that had emerged in the wake of emancipation. The man who had commissioned this photograph stood in the shadows behind Morrison, watching the proceedings with the satisfaction of a chess master executing a particularly clever gambit. Colonel Thaddeus Whitmore had been Samuel's owner before the war, and through a legal loophole that would become all too common in the Reconstruction era, he had become Samuel's guardian afterward. Whitmore was a man of medium height with silver hair and the kind of bearing that spoke to generations of assumed authority. His clothes were expensive, but not ostentatious. He understood the importance of appearing respectable to northern eyes. "The boy looks presentable," Whitmore murmured to Morrison, his voice carrying the cultured accent of the antebellum planter class. "This photograph will serve our purposes admirably." Morrison nodded, understanding the unspoken arrangement without needing the details spelled out. The photograph would be sent to northern abolitionists and government officials as evidence of successful integration, proof that former slaves were being treated with dignity and given opportunities for advancement. What it wouldn't show was the reality of Samuel's daily existence, the careful choreography of deception that made such images possible. As the camera captured its image, freezing that moment in time with the chemical precision that would preserve it for generations, Samuel's mind wandered to memories of genuine freedom. Brief, precious weeks the previous summer when he had truly believed the war's end meant liberation. He remembered the taste of fresh peaches stolen from an orchard, the sweetness made more intense by the knowledge that no one could punish him for taking them. He remembered the feeling of grass beneath his bare feet as he ran without destination, the simple joy of movement without purpose or permission. Most of all, he remembered the sound of his own laughter echoing through empty fields, a sound so foreign after years of enforced silence that it had startled him when he heard it. Those memories felt like dreams now, growing fainter with each passing day of captivity disguised as apprenticeship. Sometimes Samuel wondered if he had imagined those weeks of freedom, if they had been nothing more than a fever dream, born of desperation and hope. The flash powder ignited with a brilliant burst of light that filled the studio like artificial lightning, and the moment was captured forever on the silver-coated copper plate. Morrison began the process of developing the image, his movements practiced and efficient as he worked with chemicals that could preserve a moment in time with startling clarity. "Excellent," Whitmore declared, examining the composition with the eye of a man who understood the power of images to shape perception. "This will demonstrate to any inquiring parties that Samuel is well cared for and progressing admirably in his education and training." The words were carefully chosen, part of a vocabulary that had evolved to describe the new forms of bondage that had emerged after emancipation. Education and training were euphemisms that could justify almost any form of control, while well cared for suggested benevolence without specifying what that care actually entailed. Samuel remained motionless throughout this exchange, knowing that any sign of distress or discomfort would result in punishment later. He had learned to school his features into an expression of calm acceptance, even as the iron around his ankles reminded him, with every slight movement, that his freedom was an illusion as carefully constructed as the photograph itself. As the session concluded, and the equipment was packed away with the methodical care that expensive instruments required, Samuel was led back to the carriage that would return him to Whitmore's plantation. The shackles beneath his trousers clinked softly with each step, a sound that had become the soundtrack to his daily existence. A metallic rhythm that marked time in a life where time itself had become a form of imprisonment. The carriage ride back to the plantation took them through the heart of Savannah, past buildings that still bore the scars of war and Reconstruction. Samuel watched through the window as free people, truly free people, went about their daily business. He saw children playing in the streets, their laughter carrying on the warm spring air. He saw men and women walking with the easy confidence of people who owned their own time, their own choices, their own futures. The contrast between their freedom and his captivity was almost unbearable, but Samuel had learned to bear the unbearable. It was, he had discovered, a skill that could be developed like any other. The ability to endure what seemed unendurable, to find small spaces of mental freedom even when the body was bound. The photograph would be framed and displayed prominently in Whitmore's study, a testament to his supposed benevolence. Copies would be sent to northern politicians and philanthropists, evidence of the South's commitment to treating its former slaves with dignity and respect. The image would travel to Boston and New York, to the offices of abolitionists who had fought so hard to end slavery, carrying with it a lie so carefully constructed that it would fool even those who should have known better. But the truth remained hidden beneath that carefully positioned table, waiting more than 150 years to be discovered. The shadows around Samuel's ankles would eventually find their voice, but for now they remained silent, holding their secrets in the silver emulsion of a photograph that would outlive everyone who had witnessed its creation. As the carriage rolled through the gates of Whitmore's plantation, Samuel caught sight of other young people working in the fields, other apprentices whose freedom was as illusory as his own. They looked up as the carriage passed, their faces carefully neutral, but Samuel could read the questions in their eyes. Had he found a way out? Had the photograph session been what they all hoped it might be, a chance to reveal the truth to the outside world? Samuel's slight shake of the head was almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The other apprentices returned to their work, their hopes deferred once again. But Samuel had planted a seed that day, sitting motionless before Morrison's camera. He had begun to understand that photographs, like truth itself, had a way of revealing their secrets to those who knew how to look. Someday, he promised himself, as the carriage came to a stop, someone would look closely enough to see what was hidden in the shadows. The Whitmore plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of Georgia's most fertile soil, a monument to the wealth that had been built on the backs of enslaved labor. The main house, a Greek revival mansion with towering white columns and wraparound porches, sat like a crown jewel at the center of an empire that had once housed over 200 enslaved people. Now, in the spring of 1869, it housed something different but no less sinister, a carefully orchestrated system of legal bondage that exploited the chaos and confusion of Reconstruction. As Samuel was led back to his quarters in the basement of the main house, he passed through rooms that told the story of the plantation's adaptation to the post-war world. The grand parlor, where Whitmore entertained northern visitors, was decorated with portraits of distinguished ancestors and books on philosophy and law, props in a performance designed to demonstrate Southern refinement and respectability. The dining room featured a table that could seat 20, often used for elaborate dinners, where Whitmore would regale his guests with stories of his humanitarian efforts to educate former slaves. But it was in Whitmore's private study that the true nature of the operation became clear. The room was lined with law books and correspondence files, the tools of a man who had spent the years since the war's end finding legal ways to maintain the economic advantages of slavery. Maps of Georgia covered one wall, marked with pins indicating other plantations that had adopted similar apprenticeship programs. A large safe in the corner contained contracts, photographs, and correspondence that documented a network of deceptions spanning the entire South. Samuel's quarters were located in what had once been the wine cellar, a stone-walled room that stayed cool even in the Georgia heat. The space had been converted into a dormitory of sorts, housing 6 young men between the ages of 14 and 18. All apprentices bound to Whitmore under various legal pretexts. The room contained 6 narrow beds, a wash basin, and little else. There were no windows, and the only light came from oil lamps that were extinguished each night at precisely 9 o'clock. As Samuel entered the room, he was greeted by the other apprentices with the careful neutrality that had become their default expression. Open displays of emotion were dangerous in a place where every word and gesture was monitored for signs of rebellion or discontent. "How did it go?" asked Marcus, a 17-year-old who had been at the plantation longer than anyone else. Marcus had been born into slavery at Whitmore's plantation and had never known any other life. His parents had been sold when he was young, and he had no memory of family beyond the plantation community. "Same as always," Samuel replied, settling onto his bed and carefully concealing the pain that shot through his ankles as he moved. "Pictures for the northern folks, proof that we're all happy and grateful." The other apprentices nodded with the weary understanding of people who had learned to navigate a system designed to exploit their vulnerability. They had all been through similar sessions, photographs, interviews with visiting officials, carefully scripted performances designed to maintain the illusion of voluntary servitude. There was James, 15 years old, who had been bound to Whitmore after his mother died of fever and left him with no legal guardian. There was Thomas, 16, whose father had been killed in the war and whose mother had been forced to sign apprenticeship papers when she couldn't afford to feed her children. There was David, 14, who had been rescued from vagrancy by Whitmore's agents and bound over for his own protection. And there was Benjamin, the youngest at 13, who had been separated from his family during the chaos of Sherman's march and had never been reunited with them. Each of their stories was different, but they all led to the same place, this basement room, where freedom was a word that existed only in the speeches of distant politicians and the pages of newspapers they were not allowed to read. "Did you see anything useful?" Marcus asked quietly, using the coded language they had developed to discuss escape plans without alerting any potential informants. They had learned to be careful. Whitmore had spies among the apprentices, young people who had been broken by the system and now served as his eyes and ears in exchange for small privileges. Samuel shook his head slightly. The photography studio had been too public, too carefully controlled to offer any opportunities for escape or communication with the outside world. But he had observed something that might prove useful later: the way Morrison handled his equipment, the chemicals he used, the process of developing photographs. Knowledge, Samuel had learned, was a form of power, even when it couldn't be immediately applied. As the evening wore on, the apprentices settled into their nightly routine. They were allowed 1 hour of education each evening, during which they were taught basic reading and arithmetic by Mrs. Whitmore, the colonel's wife. The lessons were carefully designed to provide just enough literacy to make the apprentices useful as clerks and overseers, but not enough to give them the tools to challenge their situation. Mrs. Whitmore was a thin, nervous woman who seemed genuinely to believe in the benevolence of her husband's system. She spoke to the apprentices with the patronizing kindness of someone who saw them as children to be guided rather than young men whose freedom had been stolen. Her lessons focused on practical skills, how to read contracts, though not how to understand their legal implications, how to calculate wages, though the apprentices received no wages, and how to write letters, though their correspondence was carefully monitored and censored. "Samuel," Mrs. Whitmore said as she distributed the evening's lesson materials, "I trust your photograph session went well today. You should be proud to be representing our program to the wider world." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied, his voice carefully modulated to convey gratitude without enthusiasm. "I'm honored by the Colonel's confidence in me." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he had learned to speak them with apparent sincerity. Mrs. Whitmore smiled and patted his shoulder, satisfied that her husband's methods were producing the desired results. The lesson that evening focused on letter writing, a skill that Mrs. Whitmore considered essential for young men who would eventually need to communicate with employers and business associates. The irony was not lost on Samuel. He was being taught to write letters that he would never be allowed to send, to communicate with a world that he was not permitted to join. As Mrs. Whitmore demonstrated proper letter format on a small blackboard, Samuel's mind wandered to the letters he would write if he were truly free. He would write to his mother if she was still alive, to tell her that he had survived and that he remembered the songs she used to sing. He would write to the federal authorities, to tell them about the system of legal slavery that continued to operate under their noses. He would write to the newspapers, to tell them that the photographs they published as evidence of successful integration were elaborate lies. But for now, he could only practice writing letters requesting employment, or thanking benefactors for their kindness, exercises in a freedom that remained tantalizingly out of reach. After the lesson ended and Mrs. Whitmore departed, the apprentices were left alone for the final hour before lights out. This was when they could speak more freely, though they remained cautious about what they said and who might be listening. "I heard Jenkins talking to the Colonel today," whispered James, referring to the plantation's overseer. "Something about new contracts coming in from South Carolina, more apprentices." The news was troubling, but not surprising. Samuel had begun to understand that Whitmore's operation was part of a larger network, a system that had evolved to replace slavery with something that was legally different but practically identical. The apprenticeship laws that had been passed by Southern legislatures in the wake of Emancipation were being used to create a new form of bondage, one that could survive legal challenges because it operated within the letter, if not the spirit, of the law. "We need to find a way to get word out," Marcus said quietly. "People need to know what's really happening here." It was a conversation they had many times before, always ending in the same frustration. They were isolated, monitored, and legally bound. Any attempt to communicate with the outside world would be detected and punished. Any attempt to escape would result in pursuit and capture, followed by harsher treatment for all of them. But Samuel had been thinking about the photograph session, about the way Morrison had captured his image with such precision. Photographs, he realized, were a form of communication that could transcend the barriers that kept them isolated. The image of him sitting calmly in the studio would travel to places he could never go, would be seen by people he could never meet. The question was whether anyone would look closely enough to see what the photograph was really saying. As the oil lamps were extinguished and the apprentices settled into their beds, Samuel lay awake thinking about the power of images to reveal truth or conceal it. The photograph taken that day would show him as Whitmore wanted him to be seen, grateful, content, well cared for. But photographs, Samuel was beginning to understand, could carry messages that their creators never intended. Somewhere in the shadows and light captured by Morrison's camera, the truth was waiting to be discovered. The shackles around his ankles might be hidden from view, but they had left their mark on the image in ways that might someday be detected by eyes that knew how to look. Samuel fell asleep that night with a new sense of purpose. He might be bound by iron and law, but he was not powerless. The photograph that was meant to perpetuate his captivity might someday become the key to his liberation. The truth, he had learned, had a way of surviving even the most elaborate attempts to bury it. In the weeks following Samuel's photograph session, the image began its journey through the networks of power and influence that shaped Reconstruction policy. Copies were carefully packaged and sent to key figures in Washington, Boston, and New York. Politicians, philanthropists, and journalists who had the power to shape public opinion about the South's progress toward racial equality. The photograph arrived at the office of Congressman William Hartwell of Massachusetts on a rainy Tuesday morning in April. Hartwell, a former abolitionist who had fought tirelessly for emancipation, examined the image with satisfaction. Here was proof that his efforts had not been in vain, that the former slaves of the South were indeed being integrated into free society with dignity and respect. "Remarkable," Hartwell murmured to his secretary as he studied Samuel's composed expression. "This young man appears to be thriving under the apprenticeship system. Colonel Whitmore's methods seem to be producing excellent results." The congressman filed the photograph with other evidence of Reconstruction's success, never noticing the subtle shadows around Samuel's ankles or the careful positioning of the table. The image would be used in speeches and reports as proof that the South was embracing the new order, that former slaves were being treated as human beings rather than property. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore plantation, the system that had produced this deceptive image continued to evolve and expand. Colonel Whitmore had become something of an expert in the legal mechanisms that could be used to maintain control over former slaves, and his expertise was in high demand among other plantation owners struggling to adapt to the post-war economy. On a warm April evening, Whitmore hosted a dinner party for a select group of fellow planters, all of whom were grappling with the same challenge: how to maintain a profitable labor force without technically violating the new laws against slavery. The dining room was elegantly appointed, with crystal glasses and fine china that spoke to the wealth and refinement of the hosts. The conversation, however, revealed the calculating minds behind the gracious facade. "The key," Whitmore explained to his guests as they enjoyed brandy and cigars, "is to work within the legal framework while maintaining practical control. The apprenticeship laws give us all the authority we need, provided we document everything properly and maintain the right appearances." Among the guests was Colonel Harrison Blake from South Carolina, who had traveled to Georgia specifically to learn from Whitmore's methods. Blake's plantation had been struggling since the war's end, as his former slaves had fled to the cities or to other states where they could find paid employment. "But how do you prevent them from simply leaving?" Blake asked. "The law may give us guardianship, but it doesn't give us the right to physically restrain them." Whitmore smiled, the expression of a man who had solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Physical restraint is unnecessary if you control the legal and economic framework properly. Our apprentices are bound by contracts that make them liable for the cost of their housing, food, and education. Any attempt to leave before the contract expires results in debt that can be enforced through the courts." It was an elegant solution, Blake had to admit. The apprentices were trapped not by chains, but by a web of legal and financial obligations that made escape practically impossible. And if legal and financial pressure proved insufficient, there were always more direct methods that could be employed discreetly, away from the eyes of northern observers. "Of course," Whitmore continued, "maintaining the proper appearances is crucial. We must be able to demonstrate to any inquiring parties that our apprentices are well treated and genuinely benefiting from their situation. He gestured toward the framed photograph of Samuel that hung prominently on the wall of his study. Documentation is essential. Photographs, letters of recommendation, testimonials from the apprentices themselves, all carefully crafted to tell the story we need to tell. The other planters nodded appreciatively. They were learning from a master of adaptation, a man who had found a way to preserve the essential elements of the old system while clothing them in the language and legal structures of the new. But while Whitmore and his guests planned the expansion of their system, Samuel and his fellow apprentices were developing their own networks of communication and resistance. The basement dormitory had become a center of quiet rebellion, where information was shared and plans were made in whispered conversations after lights out. Samuel had become something of a leader among the apprentices, his intelligence and literacy making him a natural focal point for their efforts to understand and resist their situation. He had begun to piece together the larger picture of what they were facing, not just individual cruelty, but a systematic effort to recreate slavery under a new name. "I've been listening to the conversations upstairs," Samuel told the others one night as they huddled together in the darkness. "This isn't just about our plantation. They're setting up the same system all across the South." The revelation was both terrifying and clarifying. They were not isolated victims of one man's greed, but part of a larger pattern of exploitation that extended far beyond the borders of Georgia. The knowledge made their situation seem more hopeless, but it also gave their resistance a greater purpose. "We need to find a way to get information to the outside world," Marcus said. "People need to know what's really happening." It was easier said than done. Their mail was monitored, their movements were restricted, and any contact with outsiders was carefully supervised. But Samuel had been thinking about other possibilities, inspired by his experience in Morrison's photography studio. "What if we could create our own evidence?" he suggested. "What if we could document what's really happening here?" The idea was intriguing, but seemed impossible to implement. They had no access to cameras or photographic equipment, no way to develop images even if they could capture them. But Samuel had been observing and learning, filing away details about the photographic process that might someday prove useful. As spring turned to summer, the apprentices began to develop a more sophisticated understanding of their situation and their options. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when visitors were expected, when security would be tightened, when opportunities for communication might arise. They developed codes and signals that allowed them to share information without alerting their overseers. Most importantly, they began to document their experiences in ways that could survive, even if they did not. Samuel, with his superior literacy skills, began to write detailed accounts of their daily lives, their treatment, and the legal mechanisms that kept them bound. He hid these writings in various locations around the plantation, hoping that someday they might be discovered by someone who could use them to expose the truth. The writings were necessarily fragmentary and coded, but they painted a clear picture of systematic abuse disguised as benevolent education. Samuel documented the long hours of unpaid labor, the inadequate food and housing, the physical punishments that were administered for minor infractions. He recorded conversations he had overheard, meetings he had witnessed, and legal documents he had glimpsed while serving in Whitmore's study. But perhaps most importantly, Samuel began to understand the power of his own image. The photograph that had been taken in Morrison's studio was being used to perpetuate a lie, but it also contained within it the seeds of truth. The careful positioning, the hidden restraints, the subtle signs of distress that had been overlooked by casual observers, all of these elements were preserved in the silver emulsion of the photograph, waiting for someone with the knowledge and motivation to decode them. Samuel began to envision a different kind of photograph, one that would tell the truth rather than conceal it. He imagined images that would show the reality of their situation, the shackles, the scars, the exhaustion and despair that they were forced to hide from public view. Such photographs would be powerful evidence, impossible to dismiss or explain away. The challenge was finding a way to create such images without access to equipment or expertise. But Samuel was patient and observant, and he had learned that opportunities often arose when they were least expected. As summer deepened and the heat became oppressive, Samuel continued to plan and prepare, gathering knowledge and waiting for his chance. He knew that the photograph in Whitmore's study was traveling to influential people across the North, spreading its carefully crafted lie about the success of Reconstruction. But he also knew that truth had a way of emerging, even from the most carefully constructed deceptions. Someday, Samuel promised himself, the real story would be told. Someday, the shadows around his ankles would find their voice. 2 years had passed since that fateful photograph session, and Samuel had grown from a boy into a young man under the crushing weight of concealed bondage. At 16, he had developed the lean, wiry build of someone who performed hard physical labor on inadequate nutrition, but his mind had grown sharper and more focused with each passing day of captivity. The shackles around his ankles had become lighter over time. Not because they had been removed, but because Samuel had been secretly filing away at the metal with tools stolen from the plantation's workshop. The opportunity Samuel had been waiting for came on a humid evening in late June, when a summer storm of unusual violence swept across Georgia. The wind howled through the plantation's ancient oak trees, and lightning split the sky with brilliant, terrifying frequency. Most importantly for Samuel's purposes, the storm knocked out the telegraph lines that connected Whitmore's plantation to Savannah, cutting off communication with the outside world. In the chaos that followed the storm's passage, with servants and overseers scrambling to assess damage and restore order, Samuel saw his chance. Jenkins, the brutal overseer who had terrorized the apprentices for years, had been drinking heavily that evening. A habit that had grown worse as the stress of maintaining the deception took its toll. For the first time in months, he had forgotten to double-check the locks on Samuel's shackles before retiring for the night. Samuel's heart pounded as he felt the weakened metal finally give way under pressure he had been applying gradually for weeks. The sensation of the iron falling away from his ankles was almost overwhelming. After years of constant restraint, the absence of weight felt like floating, but he knew he had only hours before his absence would be discovered, and the consequences of a failed escape attempt would be severe not just for him, but for the other apprentices who remained trapped. Moving with the stealth he had learned during his years of captivity, Samuel made his way through the darkened plantation house. The storm had left the building in disarray, with broken windows and water damage that would require days to repair. In the confusion, Samuel's movements were less likely to be detected, but he still moved with extreme caution. His destination was Whitmore's study, where he knew the most damning evidence was kept. If he was going to escape, he needed more than just his own freedom. He needed proof of the systematic deception that had kept him and others enslaved long after emancipation. The study door, which was normally locked, had been damaged by the storm and stood slightly ajar. Samuel slipped inside, his bare feet silent on the polished wooden floor. Moonlight streaming through the tall windows provided just enough illumination for him to navigate to Whitmore's desk. The massive piece of furniture dominated the room, its drawers and compartments containing the documents that governed the lives of dozens of young people trapped in the apprenticeship system. The locked drawer that Samuel had watched Whitmore open countless times contained the most sensitive materials. The lock was simple by modern standards, and Samuel's years of observation had taught him how to manipulate it using a thin piece of metal he had fashioned for the purpose. His hands shook as he worked, knowing that discovery would mean not just punishment for himself, but potentially death. Inside the drawer, Samuel found a treasure trove of evidence that exceeded his wildest expectations. There were apprenticeship contracts for dozens of young people, correspondence with other plantation owners discussing methods of maintaining control over former slaves, and most damning of all, letters to northern politicians accompanied by photographs, including multiple copies of his own portrait. Samuel's hands trembled as he read Whitmore's correspondence with Congressman Hartwell, in which the colonel described his humanitarian efforts to educate former slaves. The letter was a masterpiece of deception, painting a picture of benevolent guidance and grateful recipients that bore no resemblance to the reality Samuel had lived. Attached to the letter was not just a copy of Samuel's photograph, but detailed instructions on how to present the image to maximum effect. Whitmore had included notes about Samuel's supposed progress in reading and arithmetic, his gratitude for the opportunities he had been given, and his eagerness to contribute to society as a productive citizen. Working quickly but carefully, Samuel gathered as many documents as he could carry, stuffing them inside his shirt. The papers crinkled softly as he moved, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent house. But he also took something else, something that would prove crucial to his ultimate success. In a corner of the study sat a small daguerreotype camera that Whitmore kept for documenting his humanitarian efforts. Samuel had watched Morrison operate similar equipment during his portrait session, and he had spent the intervening years observing and learning whenever Whitmore used the camera to photograph visiting officials or document the supposed progress of his apprentices. The camera was heavy and awkward, but Samuel managed to lift it carefully, along with several prepared photographic plates and the chemicals needed for development. He had no formal training in photography, but he understood the basic principles, and he had a clear vision of what he needed to document. Before leaving the study, Samuel did something that would prove to be crucial to his story's ultimate impact. Using Whitmore's camera and working by moonlight, he photographed the documents he was stealing, creating a permanent record of the evidence even if the originals were lost or destroyed. The process was difficult and uncertain, but Samuel's years of observation paid off as he successfully captured images of the most damning correspondence. As dawn approached, Samuel made his way to the edge of the plantation, where a small boat was moored at a private dock on the Savannah River. He had observed the boat's schedule for months, knowing that it made regular trips to the city carrying supplies and correspondence. The vessel belonged to Thomas Murphy, a grizzled Irish immigrant who had been making these runs for years and had developed a reputation for asking few questions about his passengers, especially those who could pay in advance. Murphy was preparing for his morning departure when Samuel emerged from the shadows, carrying the camera equipment and documents that would change everything. The boat captain studied Samuel's face in the pre-dawn light, noting the determination in his eyes and the careful way he moved. "I need passage to Savannah," Samuel said quietly, producing a small bag of coins he had been saving for years, tips and small payments that Whitmore had occasionally given him to maintain the illusion of fair treatment. Murphy looked at the young man before him, taking in the expensive camera equipment and the obvious signs of someone fleeing from something. But he also saw something else, a dignity and purpose that commanded respect. "You running from something, boy?" Murphy asked, his Irish accent thick with years of hard living. "I'm running to something," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the fear and excitement coursing through his veins. "To the truth." The journey to Savannah took 3 hours, during which Samuel remained hidden in the boat's cargo hold among sacks of grain and barrels of molasses. As the city's skyline came into view, he felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that threatened to overwhelm him. He was truly free for the first time in his life, but he knew that freedom would be meaningless unless he could expose the system that had enslaved him. Samuel's first stop in Savannah was the office of the Savannah Tribune, a newspaper that had been established by freed slaves and was known for its willingness to report on injustices that other publications ignored. The editor, Reverend Garrison Fraser, was a man who had himself escaped from slavery and understood the importance of bearing witness to truth. Fraser listened with growing amazement as Samuel told his story and presented the documents he had stolen. The correspondence between Whitmore and Northern politicians was damning enough, but when Samuel showed him the photographs he had taken of his own scarred ankles, the full impact of the deception became clear. "This is extraordinary," Fraser said, examining the crude but powerful images Samuel had created. "This proves that the apprenticeship system is nothing more than slavery under a different name." But Samuel wasn't finished. Using the camera equipment he had taken from Whitmore's study, he had also photographed other evidence of the plantation's true nature. Images of the basement dormitory where the apprentices were housed, pictures of the work areas where they labored without pay, and most powerfully, photographs of the other young people who remained trapped in the system. The images were technically imperfect, but their emotional impact was undeniable. They showed the reality behind the carefully constructed facade that men like Whitmore had created to deceive the outside world. The contrast between Samuel's composed expression in the original studio portrait and the brutal reality documented in his own photographs created a narrative that no amount of political rhetoric could counter. Fraser immediately recognized the significance of Samuel's evidence. Within days, the Tribune published a detailed exposé of the apprenticeship system, featuring Samuel's story and the documents he had provided. The article was picked up by newspapers across the North, creating a scandal that reached all the way to Washington. The photograph that had once been used to demonstrate successful integration was now revealed as evidence of ongoing enslavement. The careful positioning of the table, the hidden shackles, the subtle signs of distress that had been overlooked by casual observers. All of these elements were now exposed and explained in devastating detail. Federal investigators descended on Georgia within weeks, armed with Samuel's evidence and testimony. The raids that followed uncovered a network of illegal bondage that extended across multiple states, involving hundreds of plantation owners and thousands of young people who had been trapped in the apprenticeship system. Whitmore and dozens of other plantation owners were arrested and charged with violations of federal law. The apprenticeship contracts that had trapped thousands of young people were declared illegal and void. Most importantly, the systematic deception that had allowed the continuation of slavery under a new name was finally exposed to the full light of public scrutiny. Samuel himself traveled north to Philadelphia, where he was welcomed by the city's large community of freed slaves. The transition to genuine freedom was not easy. After years of controlled existence, the responsibility of making his own choices was both liberating and terrifying. But with the help of abolitionists and other former slaves, Samuel began to build a new life. He found work as a carpenter, a trade he learned with the same determination and intelligence that had enabled his escape. He married Sarah, a woman who had escaped from a Virginia plantation and understood the scars that slavery left on both body and soul. Together, they raised 4 children who would never know the weight of chains, either visible or hidden. But Samuel never forgot the lesson of that photograph. He understood that truth could be hidden, manipulated, and distorted, but it could never be completely erased. Somewhere, In some form, the evidence of injustice would survive, waiting for eyes that were willing to see and voices that were brave enough to speak. Samuel Washington's arrival in Philadelphia in the summer of 1871 marked the beginning of a new chapter. But the shadows of his past would never fully fade. The city's bustling streets and industrial energy offered opportunities that had been unimaginable during his years of bondage. But freedom came with its own challenges and responsibilities that Samuel had never been allowed to develop. The Philadelphia community of freed slaves welcomed Samuel with a mixture of celebration and caution. His story had preceded him, carried by the newspapers that had covered his dramatic escape and the federal investigations that followed. He was something of a celebrity among those who understood the significance of his revelations, but Samuel found the attention uncomfortable. He had spent years learning to hide his true feelings and thoughts, and the sudden expectation that he should speak openly about his experiences was both liberating and terrifying. Reverend Richard Allen, pastor of Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, took Samuel under his wing during those first difficult months. Allen understood the challenges faced by those transitioning from bondage to freedom, having worked with hundreds of escaped slaves over the years. Freedom is not just the absence of chains, Allen told Samuel during one of their many conversations. It's the presence of choice, and choice requires knowledge, skills, and confidence that slavery was designed to prevent you from developing. Under Allen's guidance, Samuel began the slow process of learning to be free. He attended evening classes to improve his reading and writing skills, studied arithmetic and basic business principles, and most importantly, learned to trust his own judgment and make decisions for himself. The carpentry trade proved to be Samuel's salvation. Working with wood required precision, patience, and creativity, skills that translated well from his years of careful observation and planning during captivity. His hands, scarred from years of shackles and hard labor, proved surprisingly adept at the delicate work of joinery and finishing. Samuel's first major project was building furniture for his own small apartment, a simple table, chairs, and a bed that represented his first real possessions as a free man. The act of creating something beautiful and functional with his own hands was deeply meaningful, a tangible symbol of his transformation from property to person. As his skills developed, Samuel began to attract customers who appreciated both his craftsmanship and his story. Many were abolitionists and sympathizers who wanted to support his transition to freedom. But Samuel was determined to succeed on the merit of his work rather than the sympathy of his customers. In 1873, Samuel met Sarah Jenkins at a church social. Sarah had escaped from a Virginia plantation 3 years earlier and had established herself as a seamstress in Philadelphia's growing community of freed slaves. Their courtship was careful and deliberate, two people who had learned not to trust easily, but who recognized in each other the strength and resilience that survival had required. Their wedding in 1874 was a celebration not just of their love, but of their shared commitment to building a life that honored the struggles they had endured and the freedom they had achieved. The ceremony was held at Mother Bethel Church, with Reverend Allen officiating and the entire community in attendance. Samuel and Sarah's first child, a daughter they named Freedom, was born in 1875. Holding his daughter for the first time, Samuel was overwhelmed by emotions he had never been allowed to feel during his own childhood. This child would grow up knowing that she owned herself, that her time and labor and dreams belonged to her alone. As his family grew, 3 more children followed over the next decade. Samuel became increasingly involved in efforts to help other former slaves transition to freedom. He spoke at churches and community meetings, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned about the ongoing challenges facing freed people in the South. But Samuel's most important contribution to the cause of freedom was his continued documentation of the truth. He had never stopped writing, and over the years he compiled a detailed memoir of his experiences that would eventually be published as Shadows and Light, a true account of slavery's continuation after emancipation. The book, published in 1885, created a sensation in both the North and South. Samuel's first-hand account of the apprenticeship system and the systematic deception that had allowed slavery to continue under a new name provided crucial evidence for historians and policymakers trying to understand the failures of Reconstruction. More importantly, the book included reproductions of the photographs that had played such a crucial role in Samuel's story. The original studio portrait, with its carefully hidden truth, was displayed alongside the crude but powerful images Samuel had taken of his own scarred ankles and the conditions at Whitmore's plantation. The visual contrast was devastating. Readers could see for themselves how images could be manipulated to tell lies and how the same medium could be used to reveal truth. The book became required reading in schools and universities across the North, helping to educate a generation about the realities of post-Civil War America. Samuel's success as a carpenter and author allowed him to purchase a small house in Philadelphia's growing middle-class African-American neighborhood. The house became a gathering place for former slaves, abolitionists, and civil rights activists who were working to address the ongoing challenges facing Black Americans in the post-Reconstruction era. Among Samuel's regular visitors was Frederick Douglass, the famous orator and writer who had escaped from slavery decades earlier. Douglass was particularly interested in Samuel's use of photography as a tool for revealing truth, and the two men spent many hours discussing the power of images to shape public opinion. "Your photograph," Douglass told Samuel during one visit, "may be the most important image of our era. It shows not just what slavery was, but what it became when it learned to hide." As the years passed, Samuel became increasingly concerned about the erosion of the gains that had been made during Reconstruction. The federal troops that had enforced civil rights laws in the South were withdrawn, and new forms of legal discrimination began to emerge. The apprenticeship system that Samuel had helped expose was replaced by sharecropping, convict leasing, and other mechanisms designed to maintain white economic control over black labor. Samuel's response was to intensify his documentation efforts. He traveled throughout the South, often at considerable personal risk, to photograph and document the new forms of oppression that were emerging. His images of chain gangs, sharecropper cabins, and segregated facilities provided crucial evidence of the systematic denial of civil rights that would eventually lead to the modern civil rights movement. In his later years, Samuel became something of an elder statesman in Philadelphia's African-American community. Young people would come to him for advice and inspiration, drawn by his reputation as someone who had not only survived slavery, but had played a crucial role in exposing its continuation. Samuel's message to these young visitors was always the same: truth has power, but only if people are brave enough to seek it and strong enough to speak it. He would show them the original photograph from 1869, pointing out the subtle signs that revealed the deception, and then show them the images he had taken to expose that deception. "A photograph can lie," he would tell them, "but only if we let it. The truth is always there, waiting to be discovered by those who have the courage to look closely enough." Samuel Washington died in Philadelphia in 1923, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up free. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his story and his work. The eulogy was delivered by W.E.B. Du Bois, who called Samuel a man who understood that freedom is not a gift to be received, but a truth to be revealed. Samuel's papers, photographs, and personal effects were donated to the Library of Congress, where they became part of the permanent collection documenting the African American experience. The original photograph from 1869, along with the images Samuel had taken to expose its deception, were carefully preserved as historical artifacts of extraordinary significance. But perhaps Samuel's most important legacy was the example he had set for future generations. He had shown that truth, no matter how carefully hidden, would eventually find its way to the surface. He had demonstrated that ordinary people, armed with courage and determination, could challenge even the most powerful systems of oppression. The photograph that had been meant to hide the truth had ultimately become the key to revealing it. The shadows around Samuel's ankles, hidden for so long, had finally found their voice. And in finding that voice, they had spoken not just for Samuel, but for all those whose stories had been silenced by the machinery of oppression. Dr. Sarah Chen had been working as a conservator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture for 15 years, when the photograph arrived that would change everything she thought she knew about Civil War-era documentation. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2019, and the museum had just received a significant donation from the estate of a Savannah family, a collection of photographs, documents, and personal effects that had been stored in an attic for decades. The donor, Margaret Whitmore Harrison, was the great-great-granddaughter of Colonel Thaddeus Whitmore. She had discovered the collection while cleaning out her grandmother's house after the elderly woman's death, and something about the materials had troubled her enough to donate them to the museum rather than simply disposing of them. "I don't know what all of this means," Margaret had told Dr. Chen during the donation meeting, "but I have a feeling it's important. My family has always been secretive about our Civil War history, and I think it's time for the truth to come out." Among the hundreds of items in the collection was a daguerreotype that immediately caught Dr. Chen's attention. The image showed a young African-American man, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, sitting calmly in what appeared to be a photography studio. He was well-dressed and composed, his direct gaze meeting the camera with what seemed like quiet dignity. But something about the composition bothered Dr. Chen. In her years of studying Civil War and Reconstruction-era photography, she had developed an eye for the subtle details that revealed the stories behind the images, the positioning of objects, the expressions on faces. Even the quality of clothing could tell volumes about the circumstances surrounding a photograph. "There's something off about this," she murmured to her assistant, Marcus Williams, who was cataloguing the other items from the collection. "Look at the way the table is positioned. It's not natural for a formal portrait." Marcus leaned over her shoulder, studying the image through the magnifying glass. As a graduate student in African American history, he had seen thousands of similar photographs, but he had to agree that something seemed unusual about this one. "You're right," he said. "Usually, tables in these portraits are positioned to the side, maybe with a book or flowers as props. This one seems deliberately placed to block the lower portion of the subject." Dr. Chen's instincts had been honed by years of examining historical photographs for signs of manipulation, staging, or hidden meaning. She had uncovered everything from forged documents to deliberately misleading compositions, and she had learned to trust her intuition when something didn't feel right. "Let's run this through the digital enhancement system," she decided. "I want to see if we can reveal any details that aren't visible to the naked eye." The museum's digital imaging laboratory was equipped with state-of-the-art technology capable of revealing details in historical photographs that had been invisible for centuries. High-resolution scanners could capture microscopic details, while specialized software could enhance contrast, adjust lighting, and reveal hidden elements that had been obscured by time or deliberate concealment. As the technician loaded the daguerreotype into the scanner, Dr. Chen felt the familiar excitement that came with the possibility of discovery. This was why she had chosen conservation as her career. The thrill of uncovering hidden truths, of giving voice to stories that had been silenced by time or circumstance. The scanning process took several hours as the technician worked to capture every microscopic detail of the original image. When the enhanced digital version finally appeared on the computer screen, Dr. Chen's breath caught in her throat. There, barely visible but unmistakably present, were the shadows she had suspected might be there. Around the young man's ankles, the faint outline of metal restraints was clearly visible, along with what appeared to be scarring on his exposed skin where the shackles had rubbed against flesh. "Marcus, you need to see this," Dr. Chen called, her voice tight with emotion. As Marcus examined the enhanced image, his expression grew increasingly grave. He had studied the history of slavery and Reconstruction extensively, but seeing this visual evidence of continued bondage was still shocking. "Those are shackles," he said quietly. "And look here, you can see where they've rubbed against his skin. This young man was chained when this photograph was taken." Dr. Chen immediately began cross-referencing the image with the other materials in the Whitmore collection. What she discovered painted a picture of systematic deception that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Among the papers were correspondence files, legal documents, and most damning of all, detailed instructions for staging photographs to create specific impressions for northern audiences. The young man in the photograph was identified in the collection's documentation as Samuel Washington, described in Whitmore's papers as a model apprentice who demonstrated the success of post-war integration efforts. But as Dr. Chen dug deeper into the collection, a very different story began to emerge. She found copies of apprenticeship contracts that revealed the true nature of Samuel's situation. Legal documents that gave Whitmore complete control over the young man's life until his 21st birthday. More disturbing still were the detailed instructions Whitmore had written for staging photographs and managing visits from northern officials. "This is incredible," Marcus said, studying the documentation Dr. Chen had compiled. "This photograph is essentially evidence of a crime, and it was commissioned by the perpetrator himself." But the most remarkable discovery came when Dr. Chen found a small leather journal hidden in a secret compartment of an old trunk. The journal, written in Samuel's own hand, provided a first-hand account of his experiences that corroborated everything the enhanced photograph revealed. The entries were dated from 1869 to 1871, covering the period from the photograph session to Samuel's eventual escape. They described in vivid detail the daily reality of life under the apprenticeship system, the hidden shackles, the carefully staged performances for visitors, and the systematic deception that allowed slavery to continue under a new name. One entry, dated just days after the photograph session, was particularly powerful. "They took my picture today to show the northern folks how well they treat us. I had to sit still while they arranged everything just so, making sure the table hid the iron around my ankles. Colonel Whitmore was pleased with how it turned out, said it would prove to anyone who asked that we're grateful for his kindness. But someday, someone will look at that picture and see the truth. Someday, the shadows will speak." Dr. Chen felt tears welling in her eyes as she read Samuel's words. Here was a young man who had understood, even in the depths of his captivity. The truth had a way of surviving even the most elaborate attempts to bury it. As word of the discovery spread through the museum and the broader academic community, other researchers began contributing pieces to Samuel's story. A genealogist found records indicating that Samuel had eventually escaped and made his way to Philadelphia, where he had become a successful carpenter and civil rights activist. Most remarkably, they discovered that Samuel had written and published a memoir in 1885, titled Shadows and Light, a true account of slavery's continuation after emancipation. The book had been largely forgotten by historians, dismissed as the possibly exaggerated account of a single individual. But the discovery of the Whitmore collection provided independent corroboration of Samuel's claims. Dr. Chen arranged for the museum to acquire a rare first edition of Samuel's memoir, and when she read it alongside the newly discovered documents, the full scope of the deception became clear. Samuel had not only documented his own experiences, but had exposed an entire network of plantation owners who had used similar methods to maintain control over former slaves. The memoir included reproductions of photographs that Samuel had taken himself, crude but powerful images that showed the reality behind the carefully constructed facade. The contrast between the original studio portrait and Samuel's own documentation created a visual narrative that was impossible to ignore. "This changes everything we thought we knew about Reconstruction," Dr. Chen told the museum's director during a presentation of her findings. "This isn't just one photograph or one story. It's evidence of a systematic effort to deceive the entire nation about the reality of post-war conditions in the South." The museum decided to create a special exhibition around the discovery titled Hidden in Plain Sight: The Truth Behind a Civil War Photograph. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the enhanced image of Samuel, displayed alongside the original photograph and the documents that revealed the deception. Visitors to the exhibition were invited to examine both versions of the photograph and try to spot the hidden evidence before reading the explanation. The interactive element was powerful. People could see for themselves how easily truth could be concealed and how important it was to look beyond surface appearances. The exhibition also featured Samuel's own photographs and writings, giving visitors a complete picture of his journey from bondage to freedom. The story resonated powerfully with contemporary audiences, who could see parallels between the systematic deception of the Reconstruction era and modern efforts to manipulate public opinion through carefully crafted images and narratives. Dr. Chen found herself in demand as a speaker at conferences and universities, sharing the story of Samuel's photograph and its broader implications for understanding American history. She always emphasized the same point that Samuel himself had made: truth has power, but only if people are brave enough to seek it and strong enough to speak it. The discovery also had practical implications for historical research. Dr. Chen and her team developed new protocols for examining Civil War-era photographs, looking specifically for signs of staging, manipulation, or concealment. Their work led to the discovery of several other deceptive images, revealing that Samuel's case was part of a much larger pattern. But perhaps the most moving aspect of the discovery was its personal dimension. Through genealogical research, the museum was able to locate some of Samuel's descendants, including his great-great-granddaughter, Dr. Angela Washington Brown, a professor of history at Howard University. "I grew up hearing stories about my ancestor who had escaped from slavery and become a photographer and writer," Dr. Washington Brown told Dr. Chen during their first meeting. "But I never imagined that his story would be preserved in such detail or that it would have such contemporary relevance." The reunion between Samuel's descendants and his preserved legacy was deeply emotional. Dr. Washington Brown was able to see the original photograph that had documented her ancestor's captivity, as well as the images he had taken to expose the truth. She could trace the scars on his ankles in the enhanced photographs, physical evidence of the suffering he had endured. "He always said that truth would survive," Dr. Washington Brown said, studying the enhanced image of her ancestor. "He believed that someday someone would look closely enough to see what was hidden. he was right. The story of Samuel's photograph became a powerful teaching tool, used in schools and universities across the country to help students understand the complexities of American history and the importance of critical thinking when examining historical sources. The image served as a reminder that the past was not always what it seemed, and that the voices of the oppressed could still speak across the centuries if people were willing to listen. Dr. Chen continued her work at the museum, but Samuel's story had changed her approach to conservation and historical research. She understood now that her work was not just about preserving artifacts, but about preserving truth itself, ensuring that the voices of those who had been silenced could still be heard by future generations. The enhanced photograph of Samuel Washington became one of the most important acquisitions in the museum's collection, a testament to the power of technology to reveal hidden truths and the importance of never giving up the search for justice. The shadows around his ankles, hidden for more than 150 years, had finally found their voice. And in finding that voice, they reminded everyone who saw them that truth, no matter how carefully concealed, would always find a way to emerge into the light. 5 years after Dr. Chen's groundbreaking discovery, Samuel Washington's photograph has become one of the most studied and referenced images in American historical scholarship. The enhanced daguerreotype hangs in a place of honor at the Smithsonian, where millions of visitors have gazed into Samuel's eyes and seen not just the face of one young man, but the reflection of a nation's struggle with its own conscience. The image has transcended its original context to become a symbol of hidden truth and the power of persistence in revealing injustice. It has been featured in textbooks, documentaries, and academic papers around the world. More importantly, it has inspired a new generation of historians, activists, and ordinary citizens to look more carefully at the images and narratives that shape their understanding of the world. Dr. Angela Washington Brown, Samuel's descendant, has written a biography of her ancestor that has become a bestseller, bringing his story to an even wider audience. The book, titled The Shadows Speak, Samuel Washington and the Hidden Truth of American Freedom, weaves together the historical documentation with family stories passed down through generations. Samuel understood something that we're still learning today. Dr. Washington Brown writes in her conclusion, "Truth is not just about facts and evidence. It's about the courage to see what others want to hide, and the determination to speak what others want to silence." The photograph has also inspired artists, filmmakers, and writers who have found in Samuel's story a powerful metaphor for the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. A documentary film based on his life won an Academy Award, and a Broadway musical about his escape and subsequent activism has been in development for several years. But perhaps the most important legacy of Samuel's photograph is the way it has changed how people look at historical images. Museums and archives around the world have adopted the enhanced examination techniques pioneered by Dr. Chen's team, leading to dozens of new discoveries about the hidden truths contained in historical photographs. The Samuel Washington Institute for Visual Truth, established at Howard University with funding from the Smithsonian, trains researchers in the techniques needed to uncover deception and manipulation in historical and contemporary images. The Institute's motto, taken from Samuel's own writings, reads, "The truth is always there, waiting to be discovered by those who have the courage to look closely enough." Students at the Institute learn not just the technical skills needed to enhance and analyze images, but also the historical context that allows them to understand what they're seeing. They study the systematic deceptions of the Reconstruction era, the propaganda techniques used in various conflicts, and the ongoing challenges of distinguishing truth from manipulation in the digital age. The Institute's work has revealed that Samuel's case was far from unique. Dozens of other photographs from the Reconstruction era have been found to contain similar deceptions, carefully staged scenes designed to create false impressions about the treatment of former slaves. The systematic nature of these deceptions has led to a fundamental reassessment of how historians understand the post-Civil War period. Dr. Chen, now the Institute's director, continues to make discoveries that shed new light on American history. Her team recently uncovered evidence of a coordinated campaign by Southern plantation owners to create false photographic evidence of successful integration, involving photographers in multiple states and extending well into the 1870s. Samuel's photograph was just the tip of the iceberg, Dr. Chen explains to visitors at the Institute. We're discovering that the manipulation of visual evidence was far more systematic and sophisticated than anyone previously imagined. The work has contemporary relevance as well. In an age of digital manipulation and deepfake technology, Samuel's story serves as a reminder that the manipulation of images for political purposes is not a new phenomenon. The techniques may have evolved, but the fundamental challenge of distinguishing truth from deception remains the same. High school and college students who visit the museum often find themselves deeply moved by Samuel's story. Many report that seeing his photograph has changed how they think about history and their own responsibility to seek truth in their daily lives. "I never realized how much could be hidden in a single image," wrote one student in the museum's visitor book. "Samuel's story makes me want to look more carefully at everything I see to make sure I'm not missing something important." The photograph has also become a powerful tool for teaching about the ongoing effects of slavery and racism in American society. Educators use Samuel's story to help students understand that the end of slavery was not a single moment in time, but a long and ongoing process that required constant vigilance and activism. The enhanced image of Samuel's shackled ankles has become particularly powerful in discussions about the hidden nature of oppression. Students can see for themselves how systems of control can be disguised and concealed, making them harder to recognize and resist. Samuel's photograph teaches us that oppression often hides in plain sight, explains Dr. Washington Brown during her frequent speaking engagements. The challenge for each generation is to develop the skills and courage needed to see what others want to keep hidden. The story has also inspired practical action. The Samuel Washington Foundation, established by his descendants, provides scholarships for students studying history, journalism, and photography, fields that Samuel understood were crucial for preserving and revealing truth. The foundation also supports efforts to preserve and digitize historical documents and photographs, ensuring that future researchers will have access to the materials they need to uncover hidden truths. Their work has already led to the discovery of several other collections similar to the Whitmore papers, revealing new aspects of the systematic deception that characterized the Reconstruction era. As we look back on Samuel Washington's story, more than 150 years after that fateful photograph was taken, we can see that his faith in the power of truth was justified. The shadows around his ankles, hidden for so long, have indeed found their voice. They speak not just of one young man's suffering and courage, but of the eternal struggle between those who would hide the truth and those who would reveal it. Samuel's photograph reminds us that truth is not passive. It requires active seekers, people willing to look beyond surface appearances and question official narratives. It requires the courage to see what others want to hide and the determination to speak what others want to silence. In our own time, when images can be manipulated more easily than ever before, and when the line between truth and fiction seems increasingly blurred, Samuel's story is more relevant than ever. His photograph stands as a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of documentation, and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. The young man who sat so still in Morrison's photography studio in 1869, hiding his pain behind a mask of composure, could never have imagined that his image would still be speaking truth to power more than a century and a half later. But perhaps he understood something that we're still learning, that truth, once captured and preserved, has a life of its own. Samuel Washington's photograph will continue to speak to future generations, reminding them that the shadows of the past still have lessons to teach, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance in the pursuit of truth. The shadows around his ankles have found their voice, and they will never be silent again. If Samuel's incredible story has moved you as much as it has moved millions of others around the world, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. Stories like Samuel's need to be told, remembered, and shared with every generation. His photograph reminds us that truth has a way of surviving even the most elaborate attempts to bury it, but only if there are people brave enough to look for it and strong enough to speak it. In our own time, when images can be manipulated more easily than ever before, Samuel's story is more important than ever. What other hidden truths do you think are waiting to be discovered in the photographs and documents of the past? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, the truth is always there, waiting for eyes that are willing to see. Samuel Washington believed that someday someone would look closely enough to see what was hidden in the shadows of his photograph. He was right, and his story reminds us that no injustice, no matter how carefully concealed, can remain hidden forever. The shadows have spoken. The question is, are we listening?